Judge Raymond Lancaster sat high above the courtroom, his face cold and expressionless as he peered down at the man standing before him. A black man in a sharp navy blue suit, hands calmly folded, showing no signs of nervousness. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with the tension of what was about to happen. With a slow, deliberate motion, Judge Lancaster adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "For your so-called violation," he said, his voice dripping with smug arrogance, "I am imposing a fine of $50,000. Gasps echoed across the room. The defendant didn't flinch. Judge Lancaster smirked. "If you can't pay, perhaps a little time behind bars will teach you some respect for the law." Still, the man did not react. He only smiled. And then, with a quiet confidence, he slid a small, leather-bound notebook from his inside jacket pocket, opened it, and placed it on the defendant's table. The judge squinted. At the top of the page, in bold black letters, was an official government seal. Judge Lancaster's smirk faltered. Then, he read the words underneath, his hands trembling as his eyes scanned the page. Governor James Carter, Undercover Investigation Report. The blood drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Governor. This man wasn't just any black defendant standing before him. This man was the new undercover governor, and he had just caught Lancaster in an act of corruption. The judge swallowed hard, his arrogance crumbling, his mind racing as he realized what this meant. His career, his power, everything was suddenly on the line. And the worst part? Governor James Carter was looking at him with the calm, knowing stare of a man who had been waiting for this very moment. This was a trap. James Carter hadn't always been in this position. Just months ago, he had been sworn in as the new governor, a moment of history in the making. But unlike past governors, he had decided to do something unheard of. Instead of just making laws from an office, he would go undercover, live as a regular citizen, move through the system as any black man in America, and expose the corruption that had poisoned the justice system from the inside out. His team had carefully planned every step. He had created a new identity, taken on a different name, and allowed himself to be arrested over a minor traffic stop. A broken taillight. That was all it took for the system to grip him. And the moment he stepped into the courtroom of Judge Raymond Lancaster, one of the most notoriously corrupt judges in the state, he knew the man would take the bait. For years, Lancaster had been abusing his power, handing down excessive fines, giving unfair sentences, and destroying lives just because he could. He had never been caught, never been punished. Until now, James had watched as the judge barely looked at the details of his case before setting the outrageous fine. $50,000 for a minor traffic violation? It was a joke, a cruel, racist joke, but one that Lancaster had played for years. And now, the trap had snapped shut. But what came next? Judge Lancaster's face was pale, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk as he tried to steady himself. He flicked his eyes toward the bailiff, then to the court clerk, as if looking for an escape. The room had gone eerily quiet. James Carter let the silence stretch, making the judge sweat. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, James leaned forward and spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Your Honor." The judge opened his mouth, then shut it again. James could see in his eyes fear. But before the judge could react, before anyone could make a move, bam! The doors to the courtroom burst open. Two men in suits stormed in, their eyes sharp, their movements swift. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as the men flashed their badges. Federal agents. "Judge Lancaster, you're under investigation for corruption." The judge's face turned an ashy white. His fingers trembled as he reached for his gavel, as if thinking he could regain control of the room. But it was too late. James Carter sat back in his chair, watching as chaos unfolded around him. The judge was trapped. The entire courtroom was now witnessing his downfall. And yet, something inside James told him this was only the beginning. Because corruption ran deeper than just one judge, and the real fight had only just begun. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Judge Lancaster as the agents led him away, his wrists bound in handcuffs. James remained seated, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. The people in the courtroom, lawyers, clerks, even other defendants, were still in shock. Some were whispering, some staring at him in disbelief. The governor had walked into a corrupt courtroom and flipped the system on its head. But this wasn't over. As James rose to his feet, he caught sight of something that sent a cold chill running down his spine. A man in the back row, dressed in a dark gray suit, watching him with piercing eyes. James had never seen him before, but something about him felt dangerous. Then, just as suddenly as James spotted him, the man slipped out the side exit and disappeared. James frowned. Who was he? And why did it feel like this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of something much, much bigger? The courtroom was still buzzing with murmurs as Judge Lancaster was let out in handcuffs, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing but a broken man trying to hide his panic. James Carter stood still, taking in the moment, but his mind was already moving past this victory. That man, the one in the gray suit. James had seen plenty of faces in his time, from high-powered politicians to street-level hustlers, but there was something about that man, something calculated, something dangerous. He hadn't reacted like the others. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't whispering to anyone. He had simply watched, then left. James's instincts, honed over years of working in both law and politics, told him one thing. The man wasn't just a spectator. He was someone with a stake in this game. The moment Judge Lancaster was taken away, James turned to his right-hand man, Malcolm Reed. A former federal investigator, Malcolm had been his closest ally since the beginning of this undercover mission. "You saw him?" James asked, keeping his voice low. Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, slipped out before anyone else could react. I'll get someone to run facial recognition." James exhaled slowly. Do it. As much as he wanted to savor the victory, he knew how corruption worked. It was never just one man. Judge Lancaster had been a piece on the board, but he wasn't the king, and that meant this was far from over. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with humidity. News crews had already gathered, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled to get footage of Lancaster's arrest. James and Malcolm slipped out a side exit, avoiding the chaos. "Where to now?" Malcolm asked. James checked his watch. "We go back to the safe house. I need to make a call." They climbed into a black SUV, the engine roaring to life as Malcolm pulled onto the main road. James leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. Judge Lancaster's arrest was a message, not just to corrupt judges, but to the entire system. "We're coming for you." But James also knew that messages like that came with consequences. As the city passed by in a blur, Malcolm glanced at him through the... "You think Lancaster's going to talk?" James smirked. "A man like that? He'll crack before they even finish fingerprinting him." "Good," Malcolm muttered, "because I have a feeling we're about to stir up a hornet's nest." James didn't disagree. He just didn't know how fast the hornets would start swarming. Back at the safe house, James shut the door behind him and loosened his tie. The room was dimly lit, quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. He pulled out his phone and dialed a secure number. A voice answered almost immediately. "Go ahead." "Lancaster took the bait," James said. "He's in custody." A pause. Then, "Good. But don't get comfortable. We have a problem." James's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of problem?" "The man you saw in the courtroom. We identified him." James waited. "He's Daniel Cross." James went still. Malcolm, who had been watching, frowned. "Who's Daniel Cross?" James's voice was tight when he answered. "A fixer. The kind of guy corrupt politicians and dirty cops call when they want something to disappear." Malcolm cursed under his breath. The voice on the phone continued. "If Cross was in that courtroom, it means someone with serious power just got spooked." James exhaled slowly. "And if they sent a fixer, they're already planning their next move." The line went dead. James set the phone down, his mind working at 1,000,000 miles per hour. He had expected retaliation. But Daniel Cross wasn't just a problem. He was a warning. And if Cross was involved, that meant this wasn't just about Judge Lancaster anymore. Someone much bigger was about to make their move. The attack came that same night. James was sitting in the safe house, reviewing notes when the first bullet shattered the window. Crack! Glass exploded inward, sending shards flying across the room. Malcolm lunged for his gun. "Get down!" James ducked just as another bullet whizzed past his head, embedding itself into the wall behind him. Malcolm rolled to the side, pressing his back against the couch while peering out the broken window. Sniper on the rooftop across the street. James's heartbeat pounded. This wasn't just a scare tactic. They were trying to kill him. Another bullet tore through the room, barely missing them. James reached for his own weapon, breathing steady. We need to move. Now. Malcolm grabbed a smoke grenade from his bag, pulled the pin, and tossed it toward the broken window. Thick white smoke billowed into the night. Using the cover, James and Malcolm sprinted toward the back exit, kicking open the door and diving into the alleyway. Malcolm scanned the rooftops. They'll have a team on the ground. James nodded. Then let's not be here when they find us. They darted through the alley, weaving between dumpsters and parked cars. Footsteps thundered behind them. They were being chased. James caught sight of a black van speeding toward them from the main road. The side door slid open. Inside stood Daniel Cross, and he was smiling. "Governor Carter," Cross called out, his voice casual despite the chaos. "I think it's time we had a conversation." James's jaw tightened. This was a trap, and now they had nowhere left to run. The black van screeched to a stop just feet away from James and Malcolm, its tires kicking up dirt and debris in the dimly lit alleyway. The side door remained open, revealing Daniel Cross, standing inside with the same calm, knowing smirk he'd worn in the courtroom. James had dealt with men like him before. Fixers, enforcers, shadows that moved behind the scenes, cleaning up messes that the corrupt and powerful didn't want public. And right now, James Carter was their mess. Malcolm tightened his grip on his pistol, eyes darting around the alley, looking for an escape route. We need to move now. But James didn't run. Instead, he took a slow step forward toward the van, toward Cross, his expression unreadable. Cross chuckled. "Didn't take you for the type to walk into a lion's den, Governor." James met his gaze. "Didn't take you for the type that talks before pulling the trigger." Cross's smirk widened. "I like a man who knows the game." Behind him, 3 men in dark suits sat inside the van, hands resting near their weapons, watching silently. This wasn't a hit. This was a negotiation. That meant someone high up the chain wanted James alive, at least for now. Cross gestured to the empty seat inside. "Let's take a ride. Have a little chat." James didn't move. Malcolm edged closer to him. "This is a bad idea, boss." "I know," James murmured, eyes never leaving Cross. He had 2 options. Refuse, and they try to take him by force. Accept, and he'd walk straight into enemy territory. Neither was ideal. But James Carter didn't back down. Without a word, he stepped into the van. The doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside with the enemy. The van rumbled forward, the city lights blurring through the tinted windows. Inside, the air was tense, thick with unspoken threats. Cross leaned back against the seat, relaxed, like a man who already knew how this would play out. "You made a hell of a mess today, Governor." James met his gaze. "Cleaning up messes is part of the job." Cross chuckled. "See, that's the problem. Lancaster was protected. He was one of ours. And now he's in handcuffs, singing like a bird." James smirked. "You should pick better birds." One of Cross's men tensed, hand twitching near his holster. But Cross held up a hand, stopping him. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." Cross leaned in slightly. "But let's be clear about something. You think you just took down a corrupt judge?" He tilted his head. "You only scratched the surface." James already knew that. Lancaster wasn't the king. He was a pawn. And whoever Cross worked for, they were much bigger than a single judge. Cross's voice lowered. "You're playing in a game you don't understand, Governor. And if you keep pushing," his smirk faded, "you won't just be exposing corruption. You'll be burying yourself." James held his gaze. "Is that a threat?" "No," Cross said simply. "It's a guarantee." The van slowed, turning into a dark, empty parking garage. James's muscles tensed. This was where things could turn ugly. The van stopped. The doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit underground space. Cross nodded toward the exit. "Time to go." James stepped out cautiously, Malcolm following close behind, his hands still hovering over his weapon. Footsteps echoed. 2 more men in suits stood near a black sedan parked ahead, waiting. James exhaled slowly. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. They were about to introduce him to the real power behind all of this. Cross walked ahead, leading them toward the sedan. "There's someone who wants to meet you." James wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew one thing. This was the moment everything changed. James Carter and Malcolm Reed walked cautiously across the dimly lit parking garage, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The two men in suits, standing by the black sedan, didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched, waiting. Daniel Cross strolled ahead, hands in his pockets, as if this was just another casual business meeting. But James knew better. This was a setup. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Boss, we need an exit strategy. This feels wrong." James didn't respond, keeping his eyes on Cross. He wasn't going to back out now. Not when he was this close to the truth. Cross stopped by the sedan and pulled open the back door. Inside, sitting in the shadows, was a woman. James hadn't expected that. She was in her late 40s, dressed in an elegant dark blue business suit. Her hair was sleek, her posture poised, her presence commanding. This wasn't just a fixer or a thug. This was someone powerful. Cross stepped aside, gesturing toward her. "Governor Carter, meet Evelyn Sinclair." James recognized the name instantly. Evelyn Sinclair, one of the most powerful political donors in the country. A woman who had her hands in everything, from judicial elections to law enforcement budgets. If corruption had a face, this was it. Evelyn crossed her legs slowly, her piercing gaze studying James. "Well," she said, her voice smooth like silk, "I must say I'm impressed." James didn't move. "Impressed by what?" She smiled. "By how far you got before we decided to have this little chat." Malcolm shifted slightly, tense. James could feel it too. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a test. Evelyn gestured toward the car. "Please get in. We have a lot to discuss." James didn't move. "I'm fine standing." Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Governor, you're smart enough to know that Lancaster was just a piece on the board. But what you don't understand is who's really playing the game." James folded his arms. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Evelyn sighed, as if disappointed. "You're a problem, James. Not because you arrested Lancaster, but because you don't seem to know when to stop." James's jaw tightened. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "You want to clean up corruption? Fine. Take your victory. Lancaster was sloppy, anyway. But if you keep digging," she tilted her head, "you won't like what you find." James held her gaze. "Is that a threat?" She chuckled softly. "No, Governor. It's a warning." Malcolm stepped forward. "We're done here." Evelyn's expression remained calm, unbothered. "I'd hate for you to force my hand, James. Because if you do," she paused. Then, with chilling certainty, she added, "you'll lose everything." The parking garage was silent. Then, without another word, James turned and walked away. Cross stepped aside, watching him go. Malcolm stayed close, keeping an eye on their surroundings. As they reached the exit, James finally spoke. "She's scared." Malcolm frowned. "She didn't look scared." James exhaled. "She wouldn't have called this meeting if she wasn't worried." He glanced back once. "We hit a nerve." Malcolm sighed. "Yeah, well, nerves get people killed." James knew that. And yet, he wasn't stopping now. Because if Evelyn Sinclair thought she could scare him off, she had badly miscalculated. Later that night, James sat alone in the safe house, staring at the wall. His mind was racing. Evelyn Sinclair wasn't just warning him. She was baiting him. She wanted him to second-guess himself, to hesitate, to be afraid. But she made one mistake. She had shown her face. And now James knew exactly where to strike next. Just as he was about to make a call, the phone rang first. He answered. "Yeah." A deep voice came through the line. "Governor, you're in danger." James sat up straighter. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "I used to work for Sinclair. I know what she's planning." James's pulse quickened. "Why are you telling me this?" The voice on the other end exhaled sharply. "Because you don't have much time." And then, the line went dead. James stared at the phone. Whatever was coming next, it was coming fast. James Carter held the phone tightly, his mind racing. The mysterious caller had spoken with urgency. "You don't have much time." And then the line had gone dead. James didn't believe in coincidences. Whoever had just called him had information, real information. And if they had worked for Evelyn Sinclair, that meant they had seen the inner workings of her operation. That meant they knew exactly what was coming next. Across the room, Malcolm was already pulling up surveillance feeds on his laptop. "That was bad," he muttered. "We need to move, boss." Now, James glanced toward the door. The safe house had been secure so far, but now? He wasn't so sure. He exhaled. "We're not running." Malcolm frowned. "James." "We're not running," James repeated. He looked Malcolm dead in the eye. "If Sinclair's making her move, we stand our ground and figure out what the hell she's planning." Malcolm hesitated, then sighed. "All right, then we play defense." He tapped his keyboard, pulling up street camera footage from outside the building. The screen flickered, showing live feeds from different angles. Then, something moved. A dark SUV, parked across the street. James leaned in. "Zoom in." Malcolm did. The image sharpened just enough for them to make out two figures sitting inside, their faces barely visible through the tinted windshield. Watching. Waiting. James clenched his jaw. "We've got company." Malcolm pulled out his gun. "Yeah, and something tells me they aren't here for a friendly chat." James's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered. "Talk." The same deep voice from before came through. "They're outside, aren't they?" James's heart pounded. "Who the hell are you?" The man ignored the question. "Listen to me carefully. You need to get out, right now." James stared at the screen, watching the SUV. "Why? What's coming?" A pause. Then, "A kill order." James's stomach dropped. Malcolm stiffened. Did he just say? The voice continued, "Urgent now. Sinclair doesn't issue warnings without a backup plan. She's tying up loose ends. If you stay there any longer, you'll be dead before sunrise." James looked at Malcolm. They didn't have time to debate. James turned, grabbing his jacket. "We're leaving." Now, Malcolm was already ahead of him, moving toward the back exit. Cars in the alley. James glanced at the security feed one last time. The SUV across the street was still there, waiting. But for how much longer? They made it to the alley in under 20 seconds. Malcolm had parked the car just behind a dumpster, out of direct sight from the street. James slid into the passenger seat, Malcolm behind the wheel. The moment the doors shut, Malcolm hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as they peeled out onto the street. James kept his eyes on the mirror. No movement from the SUV. Maybe they hadn't been spotted. Then, headlights. Two black SUVs suddenly pulled out from a side street, accelerating toward them. James's pulse spiked. "We're being tailed." Malcolm muttered a curse. "Hold on." The engine roared as he swerved into another lane, weaving through late-night traffic. The SUVs followed, closing the distance fast. James reached for his gun, rolling down the window just enough to see their pursuers. Malcolm glanced at him. "What's the play?" James's mind worked fast. They weren't trying to run them off the road. Not yet. That meant they wanted him alive. Sinclair wanted control, wanted leverage. James's jaw tightened. Not happening. "Next left," James ordered. Malcolm yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a parked car as they veered into a narrow street. The SUVs followed. James unbuckled his seatbelt. "Keep driving." Malcolm frowned. "What the hell are you?" Before he could finish, James threw open the door and jumped. Crash! James hit the pavement hard, rolling with the momentum before springing back to his feet. Pain shot up his side. The moment his feet touched the ground, he sprinted into the shadows of a nearby alley. The SUVs screeched to a stop. Doors flew open. Shouts filled the air. "Find him!" James pressed his back against the cold brick wall, chest heaving. He could hear footsteps, multiple. They were searching for him. Good. That meant they weren't going after Malcolm. James stayed low, moving carefully through the alley. He reached for his phone, only to realize it was still in the car. Great. No backup. No contact. No way out. He needed to think. Fast. Then, a shadow moved. James froze. Someone was already there. A man stepped into the dim light of the alley, gun in hand. Dressed in black, tactical, professional. James's stomach tightened. This wasn't just some hired muscle. The man raised his gun. Governor Carter. James didn't move. The man smiled slightly. Evelyn sends her regards. James exhaled. This was it. Then, a gunshot. The man in black jerked forward, a bullet ripping through his shoulder. James's eyes widened. From the darkness behind the attacker, another figure emerged. A man in a hooded sweatshirt, holding a silenced pistol. The attacker collapsed, groaning in pain. James stared at his new rescuer. Who the hell? The man pulled back his hood. James's breath caught. It was the voice from the phone, his mystery informant. The man looked James dead in the eye and said, "If you want to live, come with me. Now." James Carter hesitated only for a second. The man standing before him, the same voice that had warned him earlier, had just saved his life. But that didn't mean he was a friend. The man tucked his silenced pistol away and gave James a sharp look. "We don't have time for trust issues, Governor. More of them are coming." James glanced down at the wounded attacker writhing on the ground. He was bleeding but still alive, meaning there would be backup soon. Footsteps echoed down the alley. More of Sinclair's men. James clenched his jaw. He had no choice. "Fine," he said. "Let's move." The man nodded and took off, slipping into the shadows. James followed, keeping close as they darted through the narrow back streets of the city. The night was quiet, but James knew better. They were being hunted. After weaving through a series of alleys, they finally reached an abandoned building. The man yanked open a rusted door and motioned for James to step inside. James hesitated. "Where are we going?" The man gave him a sharp look. "Somewhere safer than here." James exhaled and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind them. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood. It looked like an old warehouse, long abandoned. The man pulled off his hood, revealing a scar running down his left cheek. "Sit," he said, pointing to a metal chair. James didn't move. "I'll stand." The man exhaled. "You're as stubborn as they say." James crossed his arms. "You know who I am, but I don't know a damn thing about you." The man smirked. "I used to work for Evelyn Sinclair." James's eyes narrowed. "What changed?" The man's expression darkened. "She had my brother killed." A silence stretched between them. Then the man continued. "My name is Logan Price. I was one of Sinclair's security operatives. I handled situations for her, until I realized she didn't just clean up corruption. She built it." James listened, his instincts sharpening. Logan wasn't just some whistleblower. He was an insider, a man who knew Sinclair's operation from the ground up. Logan leaned forward. "You think taking down Lancaster was a win?" "It wasn't. You just painted a target on your back." James scoffed. "I've had worse." Logan's gaze was cold. "You don't get it, do you?" James frowned. Logan continued. "Sinclair doesn't just run a network of corrupt judges. She controls law enforcement, politicians, the courts, all of it." He stepped closer. "And you just declared war on her." James let that sink in. Then he said, "Good." Logan blinked, then let out a short laugh. "You're crazy." James smirked. "And you're here because you think I can win." Logan studied him for a moment. Then finally he nodded. "You might," he admitted, "but not without help." James folded his arms. "Then start talking. What's Sinclair planning?" Logan took a deep breath. "A setup." James's expression darkened. "Explain." Logan pulled out a small flash drive from his jacket and tossed it onto the table. Inside that drive is proof that Sinclair has been fabricating evidence against politicians, judges, even business rivals. James's stomach tightened, and Logan's eyes locked onto his. "She's about to do the same to you." James's blood ran cold. Logan continued. "In a few hours, there's going to be an arrest warrant in your name. They're going to frame you, fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice. And with their people in the system." Logan shook his head. "It'll stick." James's jaw clenched. He had expected retaliation, but not this fast. Malcolm's voice echoed in his head. "We're stirring up a hornet's nest." James exhaled sharply. "When is this happening?" Logan checked his watch. "The press release goes out at 6 a.m. By sunrise, you'll be the most wanted man in the state." James cursed under his breath. Sinclair was playing for keeps. She wasn't just trying to silence him. She was trying to turn him into the criminal. And if he didn't stop it before it happened, his career, his entire mission, would be over. James grabbed the flash drive and shoved it into his pocket. Where did you get this? Logan smirked. I used to be Sinclair's right hand, remember? James nodded, thinking fast. We need to get this to someone who can expose it before they hit me with the charges. Logan hesitated. That won't be easy. Sinclair controls most of the major news outlets. James's mind raced. Who could he trust? Then it hit him. There's one person, James said. A journalist. Rebecca Lowe. Logan frowned. The investigative reporter? James nodded. She's been digging into corruption cases for years. If we get this to her, she can break the story before Sinclair buries me. Logan exhaled. All right, but we need to move. Sinclair's people are everywhere. James nodded. Then, a sudden noise. The sound of engines outside. Logan tensed. That's not good. James rushed to the window. 3 black SUVs. Pulling up fast. Doors opening. Men stepping out. Armed. James turned to Logan. You said we had until morning. Logan's face was grim. Guess I was wrong. James grabbed his gun. Then we fight our way out. Logan grinned. Now you're speaking my language. The sound of boots on pavement filled the air. They were coming. And James Carter was out of time. James Carter gripped his gun tightly, his heart pounding as the sound of boots on pavement grew louder. Outside, the black SUVs had come to a stop. Sinclair's men were here. Logan Price pulled out his silenced pistol and moved to the opposite window, peering out. His voice was calm but firm. At least 8 guys. Maybe more. Heavily armed. James exhaled. We can't take them head on. Logan smirked. Why not? I love a good firefight. James shot him a look. Because we have something they don't. A way out. Logan raised an eyebrow. You got an escape plan? James nodded. This warehouse, it's abandoned, but used to be part of an old factory district. There's a maintenance tunnel in the back. If it's still intact, it leads out to the train yard 2 blocks over. Logan considered that, then nodded. All right, but what about them? He gestured toward the men outside. James tightened his grip on his gun. We delay them. Logan grinned. Now you're talking. The first gunshot shattered the silence. One of Sinclair's men, moving toward the entrance, suddenly jerked backward, clutching his leg as he collapsed. Logan's shot had hit its mark. Man down, someone shouted. Chaos erupted. James fired 2 shots at the nearest SUV, aiming for the tires. One hit. The second missed. But it didn't matter. It was enough to cause panic. Shouts rang out as the men took cover, their plan of a quiet raid completely falling apart. Go! James yelled. He and Logan sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, ducking low as bullets ripped through the walls. The back door was locked, rusted shut from years of neglect. James rammed his shoulder against it. Nothing. Move, Logan growled. He kicked the door with brutal force. BM! And it flung open. Beyond it lay a dark, narrow tunnel, exactly as James had hoped. We're in business, James said. Logan smirked. Let's go before they get their act together. They disappeared into the darkness. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp and stale. James led the way, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. Behind them, muffled shouts echoed. Sinclair's men were inside the warehouse now. James moved fast. They couldn't afford to get trapped. How long is this thing? Logan asked. Half a mile, James answered. It'll put us near the train yard. A sound up ahead made them both freeze. James tensed, aiming his gun forward. Had someone else gotten here first? Logan flicked off his flashlight. Silence stretched. Then, a rat scurried across the tunnel floor. Logan exhaled. Jesus. James smirked. Relax. Logan muttered. I'd rather be shot at than deal with rats. James chuckled but stayed focused. They weren't safe yet. They emerged from the tunnel 5 minutes later, stepping into the open night air. The train yard was quiet for now. Logan looked around. Now what? James checked his watch. 4:13 a.m. They had less than 2 hours before Sinclair's fabricated charges went public. We find Rebecca Lowe, James said. Get the truth out before they can frame me. Logan nodded. Where is she? James pulled out a burner phone and dialed quickly. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Who the hell is calling at? It's James, he cut in. I need a meeting. Now. Rebecca's voice instantly sharpened. What's going on? I have evidence, James said. But Sinclair's trying to take me down before I can use it. I need your help. Rebecca was silent for a moment. Then, meet me at the diner on 12th Street. 30 minutes. James exhaled. I'll be there. The call ended. Logan nodded. All right, let's get moving. They started toward the street. But then, a low rumble. James froze. Logan tensed. What was that? Then, headlights. 3 more SUVs roared into the train yard, blocking the exit. James's stomach dropped. Sinclair had sent reinforcements. Logan pulled out his gun. Looks like we're not done yet. Doors slammed open. Armed men poured out. James's pulse pounded. They were trapped. And this time, there was no easy way out. James Carter and Logan Price stood at the edge of the train yard, outnumbered and outgunned. The 3 SUVs had boxed them in, headlights flooding the gravel ground in white light. Doors slammed. Sinclair's men poured out, 10, maybe 12 of them, armed, moving with military precision. These weren't just hired thugs. These were professionals. Logan exhaled. Well, this is a problem. James tightened his grip on his gun. No cover. Nowhere to run. One of the men, a broad-shouldered figure in a gray suit, stepped forward. His voice was smooth, confident. Governor Carter, he said, hands in his pockets. It's time to come with us. James didn't move. Neither did Logan. The man smirked. You don't have many options here. Logan muttered. I hate when they say that. James's mind raced. He needed a stall. Where's Sinclair? He asked. The man chuckled. Busy, but she sends her regards. James exhaled, playing for time. What's the plan? You kill me? That'll be hard to explain when my body turns up. The man shook his head. Not at all. You're too important for that. We just need you quiet. James felt his stomach tighten. They weren't going to kill him. They were going to make him disappear. Logan, however, had already tuned out of the conversation. His eyes were moving, calculating. James recognized that look. He was planning something. Logan leaned slightly toward James. Play along. James barely nodded. Logan suddenly lifted his hands. All right, you win. James's jaw clenched. What the hell was he doing? The men tensed, guns still raised. Logan smirked, stepping forward. But before we go, you might want to duck. The man in the gray suit frowned. What? Then, a train horn blared. Suddenly, behind them, a massive freight train thundered onto the tracks, shaking the ground beneath them. And Logan? He moved. Fast. James barely had time to react before Logan whipped out a smoke grenade and threw it to the ground. Boom! Thick gray smoke erupted into the air. Shouts. Gunfire. Chaos exploded. James didn't wait. He sprinted. Through the smoke, toward the train. Logan was right beside him. They could barely see, but they didn't need to. The train was moving slowly, not fast enough to be dangerous. James jumped first, grabbed onto the ladder of a passing freight car. Logan followed, grabbing onto the edge just as bullets whizzed past. The train rumbled forward, and in seconds, they were gone. Inside the moving train, James and Logan collapsed onto the metal floor, catching their breath. Logan let out a breathless laugh. That was fun. James shot him a look. You call that fun? Logan grinned. You didn't die, did you? James exhaled, running a hand over his face. The adrenaline was still pumping, but they had made it. For now. The train carried them far, out of the industrial district, past the outskirts of the city. They rode in silence for several minutes, their minds still processing what just happened. Then Logan spoke. Where's this reporter meeting us? James checked his watch. 4:47 a.m. The diner, he said. But we can't walk in like this. Logan smirked. I don't know. Bullet holes and train dust might give us credibility. James rolled his eyes. We need a car. Logan nodded. I'll handle it. They waited until the train slowed near a deserted road. Then, carefully, it jumped off. The city was still dark, but dawn was creeping over the horizon. They weren't safe, but they were still in the fight. 30 minutes later, they arrived at the diner. Rebecca Lowe was already inside, sitting in a booth near the back. James and Logan slid into the seat across from her. She stared at them, unimpressed. You look like hell. James ignored that. He pulled out the flash drive. Rebecca's eyes flickered. What's this? Proof, James said. That Sinclair is about to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Rebecca slowly reached for the drive, then glanced at him. And why should I trust you? James met her gaze. Because if you don't, they win. She hesitated. Then she took the drive. Outside, parked across the street, a black car sat quietly. A figure inside watched the diner through tinted windows. Then they pulled out a phone. Dialed. She's got the evidence, the figure murmured. What do you want us to do? A pause. Then a smooth, familiar voice came through the line. Evelyn Sinclair. Watch them, she said. And when the time is right, she smiled. Take them all. James Carter leaned back in the diner booth, watching Rebecca Lowe as she plugged the flash drive in her laptop. This was it. If she got the files open, if she saw the truth, they'd finally have a shot at exposing Sinclair before she could frame him. Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the folders. Her fingers tapped rapidly across the keyboard, her brows furrowing. Jesus, she muttered. James exchanged a glance with Logan. You see it. Rebecca exhaled sharply. Oh, I see it. Documents. Wire transfers. Fabricated witness statements. All tying back to Sinclair. And then the kill shot. A folder labeled Carter. Rebecca clicked it open. Inside were forged emails, fake bank transactions, doctored reports, evidence meant to destroy James's entire career. James's stomach turned. They had set everything up perfectly. And at 6 a.m., the arrest warrant would be issued. Rebecca glanced up at him. If I run this story, I'll be putting a target on my own back. James met her gaze. You were already a target the second you started digging. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll write it up, she said. It'll go live in 45 minutes. James exhaled. That was the first good news he'd had all night. But Logan? He wasn't smiling. His eyes were locked on something behind James, out the diner window. James turned slowly, and his blood ran cold. The black car, parked across the street. Same one from the train yard. Same one that had been watching them all night. James's pulse quickened. We've been made. Logan's voice was low. They're waiting. Rebecca frowned. For what? James already knew. For the arrest warrant to go public, he said. They don't want a scene. They want to take us clean. Logan's jaw tightened. Then we leave now. Rebecca hesitated. If I go with you, You're already part of this, James interrupted. And if Sinclair knows you have the files, she won't let you walk away. Rebecca swallowed hard. She knew he was right. James checked his watch. 5:22 a.m. They had less than 40 minutes before every cop in the city would be looking for him. No time, no backup, just one shot to get out alive. The escape plan was simple. Through the diner's back entrance, out to an alley, and then into an underground parking garage 2 blocks away. Logan had a stolen car stashed there. It wasn't foolproof, but it was their best shot. The moment they stood, the black car across the street roared to life. James muttered, "Here we go." They ran. Through the kitchen, past stunned employees, and out the back door. Cold morning air hit them as they sprinted into the alley. Rebecca struggled to keep up, but Logan grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. Behind them, shouts, footsteps. They were being followed. Fast. Logan led the way, weaving between dumpsters and fire escapes. He reached the edge of the alley and peered around the corner. Then he froze. James caught up. What is it? Logan exhaled sharply. They cut us off. James's stomach dropped. Another black SUV was parked directly in front of the parking garage entrance. Men with guns. And worse, the sound of sirens. James turned. More cars. More men. Coming from the other direction. They were trapped. Logan cursed under his breath. We're out of time. James's mind raced. They were boxed in. 2 groups. No clear exit. Unless. His eyes darted up. A fire escape. 2nd floor. Old rusted ladder. Partially pulled down. Not perfect, but it was something. Up. James ordered. Rebecca hesitated. You're kidding. James grabbed her and lifted her up. No time. Logan was already climbing. James followed, just as the first gunshot rang out. Bang! A bullet slammed into the brick wall beside him. Rebecca shrieked. Logan pulled her up to the next level while James scrambled after them. Below. Shouts. Running footsteps. They were being hunted. They climbed fast, up onto the rooftop of an abandoned office building. The city stretched around them. The sun was rising now. Logan scanned the skyline. There, he pointed to a construction site 3 buildings away. James frowned. That's our escape? Logan grinned. You got a better idea? James sighed. Fine. Rebecca groaned. You two are insane. Welcome to the club, Logan muttered. Then they ran. Across rooftops. Jumping gaps. Bullets whizzed past, ricocheting off steel vents and metal piping. Behind them, Sinclair's men were still coming. They weren't stopping. They weren't giving up. They reached the final rooftop, looking down at the construction site below. Logan peered over the edge. We're jumping. Rebecca's eyes widened. I am not. Logan didn't wait. He jumped, hit the scaffolding hard, but rolled to his feet. James grabbed Rebecca's wrist. Trust me. I hate you, she screamed. Then they jumped. The wind rushed past. James hit the ground in a crouch, Rebecca tumbling next to him. She groaned. Never again. James ignored her. They weren't safe yet. Logan was already sprinting toward an unfinished stairwell. Come on. James grabbed Rebecca and followed. They raced down the construction site, weaving between steel beams and abandoned machinery. Then, freedom. A side exit. A car parked nearby. Logan smirked. Told you I had a backup ride. They jumped in. Logan started the engine. James checked his watch. 5:57 a.m. 3 minutes. 3 minutes until Sinclair ruined his life. James turned to Rebecca. We have to get that story out. Right now. Rebecca nodded. Started typing. Her fingers moved rapidly over the keyboard. Eyes locked on the screen. James checked the mirrors. No sign of pursuit. Yet. Then, Rebecca hit send. She looked up. It's live. James exhaled. It was out there. Now it was war. Back in her office, Evelyn Sinclair sipped her coffee as she watched the news feed. Her expression remained calm, but her grip on the cup tightened. James Carter had survived. And now, he was a real problem. Sinclair exhaled. Then, she picked up her phone. Activate Plan B, she said coldly. A pause. Then the voice on the other end replied. Yes, ma'am. Sinclair smiled. Kill him. The city was waking up. The streets were filling with commuters, and the early morning rush was beginning. But inside the car, James Carter felt like time had slowed to a crawl. He stared out the window, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His pulse was still racing from the chaos they'd just escaped, jumping from rooftops, evading bullets, and barely managing to escape the noose Sinclair had nearly tightened around him. But they had done it. The story was out. Rebecca's story had hit the news at exactly 6 a.m. The headlines flashed across screens. Governor James Carter exposes massive corruption scandal. Judge Lancaster arrested as authorities investigate further. James allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But just as quickly, his thoughts returned to the cold reality. Sinclair wasn't the type to back down. She had already put a target on him. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Logan, still driving, glanced over at James. You all right? James turned to him, his eyes focused. We're not out of the woods yet. Logan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. We're alive. That's a start. Rebecca sat in the back seat, her fingers still poised over her phone. She was scrolling through the latest updates. It's already going viral, she said. People are talking, the pressure's building. There's no going back for Sinclair now. James nodded. The more attention we get, the more desperate she'll become. Logan shot him a look. So what's the next move? James exhaled. We need to get somewhere safe. And we need to figure out how we're going to bring her down for good. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice steady. I've got contacts at the FBI. They'll want in on this. We can't do this alone. James glanced at her through the rearview mirror. You think they'll back us? Rebecca hesitated, but then nodded. If the evidence is solid, they'll have to. This is bigger than Sinclair. She's been working with some very dangerous people. James knew what she meant. The corruption wasn't just in the judiciary or the local government. It had spread deep into the law enforcement agencies and even parts of federal organizations. Getting Sinclair was no longer just a matter of taking down one corrupt figure. It was about dismantling a network of power that reached far beyond the state. But the more James thought about it, the more one thing became clear. Sinclair wouldn't go down quietly. Hours later, in a luxurious penthouse suite, Evelyn Sinclair paced the length of her office, her phone in hand. The news had hit hard. The arrest of Judge Lancaster, the exposure of the corruption. It was only a matter of time before the feds came knocking. But Sinclair wasn't worried. She'd been through worse before. She always came out on top. A voice on the other end of the phone interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, we've got a problem." Sinclair's grip on the phone tightened. "What now?" "It's James Carter. He's still alive, and the story's gone public. They've already published the entire investigation." Sinclair's lips curled into a smile. "Well, that's inconvenient. Ma'am, the FBI's already asking questions. The pressure's building. There are people here who want to handle this quietly. They want Carter gone." Sinclair's eyes glinted with cold calculation. "I'm aware," but she wasn't worried. She had a backup plan, a contingency in place. She had known that one day James Carter would get too close, would try to tear down the empire she had built. She'd already made sure to cover her tracks. If things got too risky, she had a way out. Sinclair's smile deepened. "I think it's time we put an end to this charade. We'll take care of Carter, and then we'll move on to bigger things." Meanwhile, James and his team had made their way to a safe house, a secluded location outside of the city. They had to lay low for a while. It was only a matter of time before Sinclair's men would come looking for them. Logan had already started the process of securing a way out of town. He made a call to some of his old contacts who could help them disappear if it came to that. James paced the room, trying to get ahead of the next move. "What's the plan?" Rebecca asked, setting her phone down on the table. "We wait," James said. "The moment the feds get involved, things are going to get messy. Sinclair will try to cover her tracks, but she's not going to go down without a fight." Logan leaned back against the wall. "And we'll be the one stuck in the middle of it." James rubbed his eyes. "Exactly." A moment of silence passed before Rebecca spoke up again. "James, I need to ask you something." He turned to her. "What?" She hesitated, then finally said, "Do you think you can win? Against Sinclair, against everything she has?" James didn't answer immediately. He knew the odds were stacked against them. Sinclair had power, wealth, and the kind of influence that could make or break careers. But he also knew one thing. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about justice. He took a deep breath. "We've already won. Sinclair's empire is crumbling. She just doesn't know it yet." The clock was ticking. By the time night fell, James received a call from an unexpected source, an FBI agent who had been tracking Sinclair for years. The agent had seen the news, and now they wanted to work with him. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. The FBI was ready to take action, and with the evidence James and Rebecca had provided, Sinclair's empire of corruption would finally be exposed for the world to see. But as James hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sinclair was already one step ahead. She was ruthless, and no matter how hard they tried, the final battle was